Okay, welcome everyone to Awkward Devs 150. Um, a lot to cover today on the call, but high level, really only a couple main buckets. So we've been wanting to talk about testnets and their status for a while, and it always keeps getting bumped out. So I think it probably makes sense to just take like 5 minutes at the start to just discuss this real quick. Then main thing to cover is Shanghai and how we're organizing that. And I suspect that'll take us probably the entire call. If we do have some time at the end, there's still some engine API stuff as well as some execution specs and testing discussion to cover. And worth noting, there's only 2 Awkward Devs left this year. So there's today and December 8th. The other one is like 2 days before Christmas. So we'll skip that one and resume in January. So this is the second to last Awkward Devs we'll be doing this year. And yeah, happy Thanksgiving to anyone in the US. I guess, okay, to start with the testnet bit, Afri, do you want to give some context here and you know, yeah, take it away?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. A lot of people will probably be aware that we have issues with early testnet, and we have been trying to address this through different approaches. But long story short, it's actually most stakeholders say it's not worth recovering early and just get over with it and maybe just deprecate it and get a new testnet. The problem is that there's a lot of migration currently happening in the community towards Girly, and putting out an announcement saying, now, by the way, we deprecate Girly could be a blow for a lot of, let's say, bigger applications or even layer 2s that just move their entire stack. So I kind of sat down and worked out a proposal. So to address these problems, I think we need to do 2 things. We need to be more transparent and clear with regard to communications. When are we going to launch new testnets, and when are we going to deprecate old ones? And to even make it more predictable. So on the other hand, I worked out a schedule to predictably launch like a new testnet every other year and limit public testnet lifetime to like 4 years, and offer, if necessary, an additional 1 year long-term support for on top of it, so that teams have time to migrate between 2 public testnets. I was told by the community, so the wish by application developers is that we have infinite runtime on testnets, so they never want to migrate because it's a lot of work for them. And I explained them the incentives for like free public testnets are just not given, and 5 years are actually a lot of time. So they told me migrating major stacks between testnets takes around 6 months for them, including planning and execution. So yeah, long story short, I proposed that we also move Girly into deprecated status starting next year, and give it like another year to run, and then launch a new testnet towards Q3 next year. And looking at the latest numbers, so because Girly is already 4 years old, it was fit very well with the just explained 4 plus 1 years schedule. So I would say Girly could wait, where are my notes? Sorry. Girly could have hit end of life end of next year, and Sepolia would hit end of life around 2026. And I know that among client teams, it's more like testnets are free and they can be just discarded anytime. I just want to create the awareness that for client teams, for application teams, it's a different story. And I want to know if there's like a strong resistance to accept like a more predictable schedule here. And I don't know if anyone saw the linked proposal, but I wrote a lot of text around it. But the long story short is just scrolling over this table where I created this, where I basically just applied this 4+1 schedule to like future testnets.
Thank you. Anyone have thoughts? on this they want to share right now. There's the ETH Magicians thread that Afri linked as well in the agenda. We can have like a longer discussion there, but anything people want to share about the testnet? Oh, Mario?
Hey, I just wanted to mention a project on Ephemeral testnet, which we are working on in past 2 weeks. And the goal there is to create a network which automatically resets back to Genesis every given period. So it would serve as a short-term testing environment for validators or even application devs without like growing state, without supply issues. So just to let you know, I will share here a link for a repo with more resources, and if anybody is interested to help or have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Cool. Anyone else? Yeah, and Mario, if you could post that link in the ETH Magicians thread, I think that'd be great, so it doesn't get lost in the Zoom call. One last thing. So we had discussed previously shutting down Ropsten at the end of the year. It seems like it's already in a pretty bad state. Adrian mentioned there's about like 30% or so of validators online, so it's not really useful. Does anyone have like an objection to just turning everything off during the holidays? So to say, we shut it down around Christmas. And so at least, client teams can know that they can just shut everything down. We'd put out a blog post just to tell people, again, I don't think it's quite useful for anyone in its current state, but yeah, at least we can have like a clear shutdown. So anyone opposed to that? Okay, and after in whatever announcement we make, I'll make sure to link your proposal, and so people know that this is kind of the place to go for a longer form discussion about just the general future of testnets.
Thank you.
Okay, nice. So next big thing is Shanghai planning, and like in the last call 2 weeks ago, we sort of left off in the middle of trying to figure out what was going to be CFI'd or not, and we basically ran out of time there. And I think that's probably the first thing it makes sense to just discuss. Then I spent some time in the past 2 weeks talking with different client teams about like the relative priorities and how they felt about different things. I was thinking I would summarize it all before this call, but honestly, the opinions were pretty varied. So I think it's worth it for people to like take the time to kind of share their views, and so we can kind of get the proper nuance there. And then we have all these EIPs that we've been discussing that there's been updates to. But I was looking right before this call basically at like, what do we actually mean by CFI and how we've used it in the past? And generally the idea is that this is something that, conceptually we want to do, that we'd be comfortable putting in devnets, even if it doesn't mean deploying it to mainnet specifically. And so I don't know, based on the conversations we've had and kind of the work that's been happening, it feels like a lot of the EOF stuff that was not already CFI'd effectively we're acting as though it is. I'd say it's probably similar for 4844, and then the self-destruct and BLS EIPs, I'm less sure. And I think the reason why it'd be important to just like get this kind of clarified is I think it's like an important signal to the community to say, hey, these are like the things that are like seriously being considered, and then the expectation I think of the community will be something like a subset of this would be what makes it into Shanghai. Ideally, in the next 2 weeks, we can figure out what the right subset is, and we can use a big part of this call to do that. But I think first, just coming up with like a clean CFI list means we can just share that, announce it, and also, people who are not in this call can kind of share their thoughts in the next couple of weeks. So I guess maybe just to start, like, and take these one by one at a high level, does anyone feel like, the other EOF EIPs that we've been working on, I forget the exact number, but 4200, 4750, and I think 5450 is the third one, 5450. They're already sort of effectively past what we would, what our bar would be for CFI. So does anyone like oppose moving them to CFI? And again, this is not a commitment to move them in Shanghai, but just to say, we're working on this, it's on devnets, and it might be part of Shanghai. Micah and then Andrew.
Just for clarity on the CFI, am I correct in understanding that you're saying CFI means the core devs all agree this would be a good upgrade for Ethereum, but it doesn't make any sort of commitments on when? Is that accurate? Correct.
I think the commitment it makes is basically we're going to try to prototype this on a devnet, which is effectively what we've been doing. But yes, it doesn't. And I think yeah.
So something that everybody agrees is a good idea, but it may be one or two forks out, could be CFI'd. That would be a reasonable state of things. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. And I think, in this case, the more I don't know, like we also don't want the subset to be like meaningless, right? Like it's not like every single potential thing that could be considered, but I think, things that we're like seriously considering and I think one signal of that is like we're writing tests and putting it on devnets. Yeah. Andrew?
I think because we pretty much agreed that we are going for the big EOF, it's unrealistic and counterproductive to do it in Shanghai. It's also like there is no immediate pressure to do it, especially without Solidity support. Then there is no urgency. So my strong preference is to move it to Cancun, all EOF, and move it start a Cancun spec and move all the EOF to CFI. And also, I believe that a good, almost production or better production quality Solidity support is a must for EOF.
Okay, I guess, yeah, I'm curious. I know there's other client teams who feel stronger about having this in Shanghai. So does anyone just want to voice that opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if EOF doesn't go in Shanghai, it's increasingly unlikely it goes into a future fork. I think we have big upgrades that we want to do in like many of the next forks. And it's always going to be this debate of, this is the important thing. We want to make the fork small. We want, that thing to go in because it's important for the roadmap, whatever. And I think that with withdrawals and EOF, this is like a perfect time to have like a relatively small fork and do EOF. So if we move it to Cancun, I just really think it's going to get bumped out of Cancun too.
Okay. I think, my view on even if we were to move it to Cancun, I think we should still CFI it, and we can make the decision basically on the next call of, moving it to the next fork. But I think the signal, clearly, if the argument is we should maybe do this in Cancun and not Shanghai, that would push me towards having it CFI'd so that it's clearly labeled that way. Marius?
Just to kind of rebut Matt's argument, I think if something is so low priority that it shouldn't go, that it won't go into the next fork because we have something else, then why should we do it now? If only because now we have a bit more room in the fork, we should.
I just think the people who are loudest on these types of calls don't prioritize changes to the EVM. And I don't think that's an accurate representation of everyone in the community. And so I think that for that reason, things will get bumped. And that's not necessarily a total representation of what people desire for the EVM.
Denkrad?
Yeah, I think I'm very worried about trying to prioritize it for for Shanghai if that's by an argument, oh, like let's make it a small fork. Like as I think I've said before, I think it's crazy to like reserve a version for like a minimal version of EOF that isn't actually very useful. Like I mean, I think like reserving an extra version in the EVM should be considered a huge step and should only be done when there's really important changes that actually make sense and that provide us like significantly better security guarantees, better analysis, better like scaling. Yeah.
Right, and that's why we've made this EOF upgrade now like the bigger suite of EOF EAPs because of that critique. And now I think like this version of EOF is, hits those points.
Yeah, and it's worth noting the two kind of counter arguments against EOF still kind of make me lean towards CFI because right now we do have 2 of the 5 EOF EIPs CFI'd. So I think, and we can discuss like the status of things after, but I think just to not take up all of the time, moving the 3 other ones, given that this is, if we do EOF, it's very much leaning towards being those 5 EIPs. That seems more coherent than having like 2 out of 5 of them CFI'd and the rest not. Yeah, Andrew?
Well, I think they should be CFI'd, but it's not a good idea to CFI them for Shanghai because
correct, yeah.
Shanghai. And with Cancun, like with the CFI for Cancun, we have a clear commitment that we are working on it. We do think it's a good idea. It just, well, at least my opinion, it's a big change, and I would hate to rush it and end up on some unused or like semi-broken version that we'll have to support forever.
Yeah,
but
I think
for Cancun, there is enough time.
Yeah, so I think I would still, we don't have like Cancun, given we don't even have a scope for Shanghai, I think I would lean to make it CFI. All of the CFI thing will be like for Shanghai, but there's this expectation that not everything makes it into Shanghai. And then, some of what doesn't make it would likely make it into Cancun. So I think it's just probably easier for people to understand if it's all in one place.
But why not move it to why not create a Cancun and move all the EOF there?
So I'm not clear that there's
a clear separation of like all EOF is in one place CFI'd for Cancun. We can mark it as like starting with enabled at the Cancun block in EVMC or Geth or whatnot. So there is a kind of more clarity.
Yeah. So I think that's maybe like the second step of the process. It's not clear to me that like that's the general consensus, whereas like we probably want to do this at some point feels like obviously some people disagree with that, but it feels like there's definitely more consensus there. And then when we do it, I think it's just like a separate conversation. But I'd want to just try to get the first part of it settled, and then we can kind of then we can discuss when we do it and relative to everything else that's being considered. Alex?
Yeah, I would like you to reflect to this notion that it's not useful for Solidity and or it may be broken if it's rushed. I just would like to ask, what would be the way for Solidity to signal that they would be interested in this change? Because Daniel already did that on the Discord, but seemingly that wasn't like a strong enough signal. So what would be a convincing argument from Solidity for this group?
Andrew?
Well, my position that working Solidity compiler into EOF without dynamic jumps is a convincing argument. And that's pretty much, in my view, a prerequisite. Not a commitment, but a working compiler.
It'd be correct to say that you would like to see Solidity implement first, then the EVM implement it rather than the other way around.
Well, both can be done in parallel.
Solidity would implement it. Obviously, you need support in the EVM, but before it's deployed to mainnet, I think is what Andrew.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thomas?
And that's my suggestion as well. Like all the changes of Solidity side and the EVM side should be prepared and tested together on testnet. And people should say that, yeah, there are observable improvements and there's an indication from Solidity users and Solidity compiler teams that the changes that are implemented in Solidity and testable on testnet are ready to go. And then we all have everything to say, yeah, they delivered what was needed. Solidity team didn't discover anything that that actually was against their assumptions.
Got it. Okay, let's do Alex, and then I think we can move on to another one and discuss EOF specifically and which fork it should be in later. But yeah, Alex?
Yeah, so Solidity is working on an implementation, and it is slated to land this year, so which means basically before Christmas. But at the same time, you know, the core developers of Solidity have said that this wouldn't break anything. This should work. And now we are basically doubting their understanding of both the compiler and the EVM. And also, you know, just generally when stuff there's zero agreement about whether something is useful or not from this group, that is a signal for, you know, people like Solidity not to do anything with it, because also their time is very limited. And the EOF has been pushed back for 2 years at this point. And that's why Solidity hasn't implemented it, because, you know, they also have a lack of people and they had to prioritize other things.
Okay, so
Alex, last time everything was implemented already in the clients, and it's in like the changes for the EVM, and then it was not used. So the example is working the other direction.
I mean, most of it is implemented except the functions. But I mean, that's why I think like it's CF. I mean, the previous example, the subroutine Solidity objected it from the beginning. Maybe they just weren't loud enough. You know, I mean, just as now.
Okay, just to make sure we can move forward, I don't think I've heard anyone say this should not be CFI'd, and we can, yeah, and we can discuss like the specifics of EOF later, but does anyone disagree with moving the 3 other EIPs, which we've already started prototyping in our devnets, to CFI, along with the other ones? It's not a commitment for Shanghai specifically. Last chance. Okay, so let's do that. Let's move those 3 to CFI. The next one that's in a similar spot where we've started prototyping it on devnet already. There's a bunch of client teams that are working on it, is 4844. And I think this is also very much one where, you know, some people really want to see it in Shanghai, some people don't. But leaving like which fork aside and whether it makes sense to couple it with withdrawals, does anyone disagree that like this should be CFI'd? Okay, this one was much easier. So let's move 444 to CFI, and we can discuss it in more detail after. And I think, okay, I'll push back on your comment, Maris. I think this is like a perception that if you attend all of these calls and have like a very good context of like all the stuff that's being considered, then maybe it's obvious what's like CFI or not. But in the past couple of weeks, like a bunch of people outside of these calls have mentioned to me it's not. So like having this signal to like people who don't attend these calls that these are the main things being considered and debated, it's almost more useful for them than for us. And this is why I think it's worth insisting on having like the clear distinction.
how do they act upon it? I'm just curious. Like
So
now that 484 is CFI, like how does that change the operation of people outside of this like group?
so I think it
Because
makes
it's
people
not in Shanghai yet,
right.
right? It's
Yeah.
like we consider as the core dev call that we think this is an important upgrade for Ethereum.
Yeah. And I think the CFI just reflects that basically. And it's like a way for people to know that this is the case and have like somewhere that it's written down. But that's yeah. I don't know that it affects their actions, but it affects their perception of the process. Yeah. Um, um,
Well, I would say one thing, which is basically that moving to CFI does put a strain on client developers and the resources that we have to allocate to things. So
right. Yeah.
regardless if it goes into Shanghai or any other fork, like this is going to, like, saying that something goes into CFI will divert resources in that direction, and it will delay anything else that is CFI, really. That's maybe the best way to put it.
I think that's true, but I think, and then it's already the case for 4844 and EOF, right? Like there's already resources from teams, yeah, that are allocated to both those things. Yeah, but I do think, yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, definitely, like client teams feel like more pressure to like work on it once it's CFI'd, but yeah. Okay, and I think there's two more we discussed last call that I think are like maybe slightly less obvious about what we should do. Oh yeah,
Can
please.
I just want to jump in and share my perspective on the CFI from the Coinbase lens, which is that I'll just share the kind of anecdote that even though Coinbase has been working for the last 6 months on 4844, I'd say inside of what is now like a 5,000 person company or 4,000 person company, there's very, very little understanding of what Ethereum's overall kind of like roadmap priorities are and where Coinbase has opportunities to contribute and like make a difference in both the kind of ability for us to execute quickly and safely and to kind of like figure out what should happen when. And so I think the thing about CFI and like the way that Tim's presenting it that I like is it is just like a checkpoint basically where it's like, hey, these are the things that Ethereum is saying are like ready to be executed against, and like over the next year or next 1 to 2 years will happen, and like Coinbase, come and figure out how you can contribute to that. I think without some formal recognition and process, that just becomes really hard, and it instead becomes about like people like me who sit on this call, taking it back to like people like Brian who have, you know, Brian Armstrong, our CEO, who have like 15 minutes to understand this kind of thing. And that kind of like, you know, word of mouth is less effective than being able to say, hey, here's the list of things that like everyone is aligned on being important over the next year. Like, how do you want to help make these things happen?
I just want to also add on top to that from our end, Prism, we've been actually working on it for the last 6 months, and thank you, like Optimism and then like Coinbase for the support as well. But I do want to echo like Yasi's comment. I think we should be a little bit more cautious just because like from our point of view, I don't think we should delay withdrawal. I think withdrawal should be the #1 priority as a core dev. We should get withdrawal out as soon as possible and also as safe as possible. So I wouldn't like basically say today if you have 100% resources working on withdrawal, I wouldn't shift those resources like working on 4844 and having to delay withdrawal for 4844.
Okay. Yeah, and thanks for sharing. And I think, you know, one part of this is like a lot of this stuff probably should have been CFI'd and like before as we were starting to work on it. And it's like now just making sure that the status tracks what we're actually doing. And that provides like legibility to people outside this call. We can discuss the specific definition of it offline. We'll probably take the whole rest of the call if we were to do that here. I think at a high level, the things that like we're already working on have resources already allocated are being built on devnet, it seems reasonable to move them to the state they should have been in, and then we can debate how they should all come together in a fork. I think the two more that we did discuss and might make sense to CFI were the self-destruct removal EIP. I think this one's a bit different. I'm not aware that anyone's been working on it directly, but I think a lot of people want to see it happen and think it's important. So yeah, that's one I'd be curious to hear from clients if we think it should be CFI'd. Oh, and Geth has it. Sorry. I don't know, Jesse, if your hand is still up for that. No, okay, Rob.
Yeah, hello. So my name is Rob. I am a Ethereum dev, and I have built something called Revest protocol, which uses the self-destruct pattern in its contracts. What we do is we do a very unusual system, and I came here today to tell you all about it because the proposed change would unfortunately brick our contracts and result in hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars being permanently locked. What we do is, and we did this actually to, ironically enough, we did this to help with state growth and increase security. The idea being that we deploy a contract. Well, actually, to begin with, when a user makes a deposit, we use an individual ID to predict where the create2 contract will live with that salt, with the ID as that salt, and then we send their funds to that non-existent contract that we will deploy in the future. When they're ready to withdraw, we use that same ID, and this is an NFT ID actually, so kind of fun. But we use that same ID to say, okay, this we're going to deploy the contract now. We're going to withdraw however much funds the user wants to withdraw. There is a situation where the user does not withdraw all the funds. So that's the edge case that causes the problem. So the user withdraws the funds, and then at the end of that transaction, to prevent state growth and keep the transaction cheap, we call self-destruct. That results in the contract being destroyed and there never having been a record of it at the end of the transaction. So it never exists between blocks or between transactions. The problem with 4758 and its impact on us is that create2 is designed to revert if a contract exists at a given address. And in the course of this, if the user were to withdraw partially in one transaction, they would no longer be able to access any of the funds that are sitting in the contract now, because the system still thinks the contract doesn't exist. It'll try to deploy a contract at that address again. But because 4758 has deactivated self-destruct, now we can no longer actually have ability to retrieve those funds. So I guess I just wanted to come here and suggest that the implementation of 4758 take that into account and perhaps have some sort of an edge case check to make sure that if a contract is deployed in the same transaction, that it can in fact be removed in that same transaction. Allowing that edge case would solve all of my problems and would mean that this wasn't a problem for me and for several other people I know who are using the same pattern.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, and that's definitely something that we need to consider. I think Vitalik, you had your hand up first, and then Ansgar.
Yeah, so one thing I wanted to mention on self-destruct in particular is that I think one good argument for pushing it into CFI early is because historically we have been bad at convincing the community that some change that might break compatibility is actually going to happen, and people actually need to take it seriously, right? So thinking back to some of our previous examples, particularly with increasing some gas costs. And so like this is to some extent the like one of the best signals that we have that like, hey, this is a thing that's actually slated to happen, and that is not just a couple of people in a quarter randomly thinking about it, and so that would reduce the chance of more applications that depend on the self-destruct feature being created in the future. And then, as was said before, like CFI does not mean one fork; it could mean 2 forks from now or 3 forks from now, and these kinds of things should absolutely have long periods between decision and implementation, just because there's so many applications. But of course but then obviously there's like issues on the other side, right? Which are that it's if we want to consider a change that will reduce its impact to a couple of important applications, and if the same transaction edge case does it, then that's to me that's absolutely worth thinking about. And I don't know whether or not that's incompatible. I don't know what that obviously does kind of affect the whole CFI, what is the meaning of CFI discussion, but just wanted to keep in mind the broader picture of to the extent that we are going to do stuff that breaks backwards compatibility in the future. So just examples of things that will break backwards compatibility in the future. Vertical trees are a big one that'll break every application that relies on manual introspection and in EVM verification or in Stark verification of state Merkle branches. So that for those kinds of things in the future, we should somehow be cognizant. We should have some ability to signal that yes, this is actually happening in a way that's much ahead of actual execution, because that's going to be needed for developers, and just generally better think about the issue of how to handle these kinds of things so that we're both actually able to make changes that have long-term benefits that are worth it, but also do them in a way that does minimize their costs and leaves room open to make changes that minimize costs further if options for doing that appear.
Thanks. Ansgar, I think, you had your hand up and had some comments about this in the chat as well.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say I think I generally agree with Vitalik in that I think it would be really useful to have some advanced signal of commitment to making changes just for the outside. But I do think that the CFI as we currently have it is just not quite the right format, because to me at least the meaning of CFI really is that in the EIP in its current form is at least already considered for mainnet. And I just don't think for example, right now I would be very strongly opposed to bringing the EIP as is to mainnet without at least having fully evaluated the same transaction kind of edge case. So the EIP is just not ready yet. And I'd be very hesitant to basically break with the meaning of CFI purely for the signaling purpose of it. Especially because we see kind of Rob coming on this call here already. People do start to be aware of kind of self-destruct and the self-destruct removal in general. So I think, I really think we should stick with kind of what CFI is supposed to mean and only move EIPs to CFI that are basically final.
Right, and I think basically for you the bit that would make it worthwhile to move this is if we have this edge case, at least proposed as an option in the EIP, and we've had EIPs in the past that propose different edge cases or different ways of solving stuff. So at least having some spec for how we deal with this create to Andrew?
I basically agree with Ansgar. I think if we update this EIP to include the still allow self-destruct within the same transaction, then afterwards we can move it to CFI, but not beforehand.
Okay. Dankrad?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to respond to Ansgar because clearly, like now we have the situation that since we have already very strongly considered deactivating self-destruct, someone has deployed new contracts that make use of it. So clearly, they haven't noticed that like this really should not be used anymore. So like yeah. I don't quite understand like what you are suggesting how to solve this here.
Well, there were some proposals about, if the self-destruct happens within the scope of a transaction or something like that, you can still keep self-destruct. And we discussed a lot of these. Like,
yeah, sure. But I mean, this contract specifically was deployed at a time when it was already very clear that we're going to deactivate it. Like there was like, this was like, just wasn't set to CFI, but I think like there was like a clear momentum towards that already. And now now we're adding like a special case. I mean, like, let's just consider this is like a huge thing. This is like technical debt that we're adding to the VM to support this one very special, like this one case, this one contract forever.
Well, there's more than one, to be clear. I think we are still looking into like how many there are, but it's not a case where there's a single contract affected. There's like a pattern, and there's at least a handful of like contracts with with significant views that are affected. Andrew?
Well, my position on technical debt is that like there are different kinds of technical debt. So backwards compatibility is very important. So, okay, but if by technical debt we mean that there are some extra 10 lines of code and like some extra 10 lines in the spec, then to my mind, it's not a big deal. So you write it, you test it, you pretty much never change it. It doesn't affect like your performance strategically.
Oh, I highly doubt that this is going to be 10 lines of code. Like, sorry.
Well, yeah, we can. We need to investigate, but if it's a reasonably small piece of code that mitigates a number of real contracts, then to my mind, it's worth introducing this small technical.
Well, this is going to change. This is going to have to change the way you write state, because it means that because like we don't support, like the whole point of self-destruct, deactivating self-destruct, is that we don't want to support deleting contracts from state. Now, this means that in order for these temporary contracts, you will have to add a way of not writing that state during the transaction and like keeping in some cache somewhere. So I'm warning against that. I think like this will be much more complicated than people imagine.
We already have such data structure in Aragon and Geth, and probably in the other EO as well. We already do it. It's like no technical debt on that side.
Okay, Ansgar, I see your hand is up again, and then you can,
Right. I just wanted to briefly clarify that from my point of view, I didn't want to say that I would want this change in the EIP before marking it CFI. I just think that basically exploring this question, and I think Dankert specifically illustrates why this is a complicated question. It's not just like, okay, yeah, sure, we could do it. It's like this seems like maybe desirable, but it could also introduce meaningful extra complexity. So this is just like a small, basically side research question within the EIP that's just not explored yet. And I think that means it's premature for CFI. That's all.
I'd be curious to hear from other client teams as well. I think, basically, is this the general feeling that to make this CFI, people would want to see at least some like explored or fleshed out proposal for how to deal with these edge cases, or is this something because it's going to impact people and we want to figure out how it's going to impact them and have people show up, we should kind of make CFI now so that people have like a strong signal that it's happening, and we can, even if that leads to like massive changes to the spec, because we need to accommodate some edge cases.
unfortunately, I think the answer to your question requires us to all agree on the definition of CFI, which it sounds like we still do not, unfortunately.
So I guess, using the ones you posted in the chat, the second one was like, client devs would like to see this in the next handful of hard forks. Yeah, that seems reasonable. Yeah, Liam?
Come back to me after we finish this.
Okay. Okay, I guess, does anyone oppose, like, moving it to CFI? Like, I mean, I guess Ensgar does.
Yeah, I oppose as well.
Okay. Okay, so I think, there, the next step for this would be to actually flesh out what those edge cases and solutions are, and we can have that conversation at a later time. Lucas?
So I'm not opposing moving to CFI if we can have a CFI with a big asterisk that this spec is not yet finalized because of edge cases.
Okay.
And in terms of the edge case itself, I think we should, where it's possible and the cost isn't enormous, and it seems in this case it isn't enormous, to keep as much backwards compatible as we can. Yes, it is something that complicates things a bit, but unfortunately that's life of supporting a low-level system that a lot of higher-level systems are built upon. And I don't think we should break it. Us supporting as much as we can of existing stuff makes us seem more reliable in the long term.
Liam, you had your hand up, and then Andrew.
Yeah, I mostly wanted to understand just kind of where we landed with 4844, which I can go into more detail about where I'm thinking of there, but is this the right time to jump in? Do you think, Tony, about that?
Okay, yeah. So I think for 4844, we've CFI'd it. Clearly, people want it at some point in the next couple of forks. If it's Shanghai or not is still to be decided. And I think, it probably makes sense to move to like what our client team's perspective on what Shanghai should be. The only specific EIP we haven't touched on is the BLS one. So I don't know. I guess, yeah, maybe let's just do BLS quickly, then we can discuss Shanghai. So we're kind of done with the CFI stuff. But does anyone have a strong opinion in either direction about whether we should CFI BLS and consider it for either Shanghai or the fork after? And we don't have to.
I think we should.
Okay. Does anyone disagree with that? Yeah, BLS was CFI'd for Berlin. Yeah, does anyone disagree? It should also be CFI. Okay, I will take this as a no. So just to recap, these are all the things that are considered in the next forks. We've added the rest of the EOF EIPs, and we've also added 4844 and BLS, self-destruct. I think we want to see just some better thinking around the edge cases. Yes, rest of EOF, that includes 5450. Okay, so now, obviously, we have all these things we could be doing. Which ones of them we should do when is the biggest biggest discussion. I asked all the EL teams what they thought about this in the past 2 weeks, and the answers were like pretty different. So I think it maybe makes sense for just the different EL teams to take a couple minutes, and then there's some CL folks here as well, to each just take a couple minutes to kind of talk through what would be your preferred kind of outcome for Shanghai specifically, and how that relates to everything else. Yeah, we can go from there. And Matt, I know you've been sort of in the chat dying to have this conversation. So do you want to start? And yeah, we can go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I for a while have felt that it's best to try and keep Shanghai small. You know, historically, client teams have preferred smaller forks to like very large forks, and I think that if we go into this saying like we'll do withdrawals in 4844 and EOF, that something will end up breaking later on and something will get lost, and we'll spend a lot of like development cycles and energy trying to do all of the things, and then we come out with less of the things and more energy expended. So I'm like a proponent for being very focused on a small fork and then trying to like somewhat quickly after have, you know, another small fork rather than putting all of the eggs into a single basket. So my preference is withdrawals and EOF for Shanghai. Try and do that sometime in March, and you know, and then the other CFI EAPs, or sorry, not the CFI EAPs, but the things that were CFI prior to this call, and then doing like a Cancun fork with 4844 sometime, you know, Q3.
Got it. Thanks. Anyone from another client team?
I think our preference is also to do a small Shanghai release with just withdrawals and the 3 small EAPs. But if we want to make it bigger, I would, I guess, go for either 4844 or 2537. So pick one of those, not make it too big.
Okay. Anyone from Besu or Nethermind?
Yeah, I think we are agree with Andrew. So withdrawals should be a top priority, and we should decide what we want to target, what we want to try to deliver. If we notice huge delay because of this thing, we can do it later. But generally, withdrawals plus trying to deliver EOF or EIP for 844.
Great. And do you have a preference between those two in Nethermind, or whichever one is easiest?
I think team agree that we are slightly prefer 4844.
Got it. Besu?
Yeah, so we're pretty much on the same page as I think what Light Client outlined, definitely withdrawals. I think we're more comfortable with all of EOF going in and then deferring 4844 to Cancun.
Got it. So just to recap on the EL side, obviously everyone wants withdrawals to come as soon as possible, and then the handful of small EIPs that we'd considered before, and then there's probably room for something else. Whether that something is 4844 EOF is not clear, yeah, there was a bunch of comments from like CL devs in the chat as well. Does anyone want to share their view there?
Yeah, I guess I can go first. I think like withdrawal remains the highest priority. I think as a core dev, we have a responsibility to get withdrawal out as fast as possible, and then also as secure as possible. And I personally would not want to see withdrawal being delayed by like anything else, and that's just my perspective. And then after withdrawal, definitely 4844, just because I don't think CL have to worry about EOF like luckily.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think 4844 is a good target after withdrawal.
And when you say after, that would be a separate upgrade, right? Or
yes, assuming there's delay, yeah.
Okay, right. Okay, so if 4844 was to delay withdrawals, then we would just remove it. Okay. Anyone else on the CL side?
Yeah, I agree
Paul
with
from Lighthouse here. I don't have a consensus from the entire team, but my personal consensus is aligned with Terence.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, Teku here. Agree with Terence and Paul. I think there are many unknowns about 4844. We haven't tested it in a network environment, and there is extra load on the consensus clients that we have not quantified yet. So there are uncertainties around that. Committing to have it in Shanghai introduces uncertainty about timing on that, and will inevitably delay things. We love to be optimistic, but I think it will potentially delay by several months withdrawals. Favor a small withdrawals fork on the consensus side, and then separate that, decouple it from 4844. That's personal view, not speaking for Teku team specifically.
Thanks.
Yeah, I can agree with what both Ben and everybody else has been saying, which is that we want to ship withdrawals. Our testnets for withdrawals are coming now, and there's holidays coming up. 4844 inevitably will delay Shanghai if we put it in there. So I would prefer to see a smaller Shanghai and then faster Cancun, let's put it this way, so that we can ship 4844 in a timely way as well.
Thanks. Anyone else on this CL side? Okay. We can do Andrew, and then I know Liam, you had your hand up earlier, and Proto, you had a bunch of comments in the chat, so I think it probably makes sense for the two of you to go after that. But yeah, Andrew.
Well, just an open question. So what do people, mostly other EL clients, think about then if 4844 is going to delay Shanghai? Then should we include either 1153 or BLS precompiles 2537? Like, what's the sentiment? Like, pick one of those. Are they useful? Do we want them in Shanghai?
I think they're useful, but I think they would also delay. So, from my perspective,
Yeah, I agree with Marius.
just what Matt said. EOF withdrawals in Shanghai, and 1153 and 4844 in the one after that. And I hope that by then we can stop calling it Cancun and have only use the CL fork names.
Ansgar?
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to briefly say that I think it would be important to talk generally talk about timelines here, kind of just to contextualize this discussion, though, because I think a absolutely minimal fork could make sense. I personally, I would like to just hear some clarification around. It seems like some people were basically, like Geoff, for example, made it sound like EOF would not be an extra constraint at all, whereas some other clients made it sound like basically withdrawals plus one big change. So that sounded like EOF would delay. Like I personally I think if we do a kind of minimal withdrawals fork, it should really be a fork that we can deliver on whatever the absolutely fastest timeline is we can, like, I don't know, February fork or something. And then yeah.
And I think given everybody wants withdrawals to happen ASAP, there's some conversation in the chat about like what's the quickest we can fork. I think realistically for mainnet it's probably March. It's basically end of November now. Assume you get all of the implementations done before Christmas. That means you're testing stuff in January, you're forking testnets in February, and you're like forking mainnet in March. It's hard to imagine things going quicker than that unless there was some sort of emergency. So maybe using that as like an anchor of what we can do. Assuming we wanted to fork and have withdrawals go live in March, what's possible to include alongside that, and that doesn't delay withdrawals significantly. yeah, I don't know if anyone has like a strong opinion there of, I guess, get a shared, like for them it would be withdrawals plus EOF, and it's unclear if other people feel that way about the EOF. And I know earlier in the chat, Proto was saying that, if that's the line for 484, we might be able to do it. So yeah, anyone have thoughts on this? Proto?
So based on the CFI discussion, like the meaning of CFI, I think like us core devs on this call, we're not really doing our job very well. We should be signaling and discussing these EIPs in detail on these calls based on the merits of the EIPs and to like explain the impact and what it has on Ethereum as a protocol. And we should be listening more to signals outside of this call to set the roadmap rather than prioritizing EIPs purely on what we think is the right thing to do. And so with EIP 484 specifically, we are making this big impactful change to Ethereum as this data availability layer. And I think this is super undervalued. Delaying this would basically mean rollups today keep hijacking call data for something it was never used, never designed for. And at the current rate, this means that Ethereum just grows linearly and will keep growing linearly. These resources are misallocated and users are overpaying a lot for layer 2. And by changing this, long-term layer 1 can have less stress, be less stress on the disk space and the consumption of layer 1 exclusion layer clients. And by basically creating this zero-sum game between 4844 and the EOF EIPs, we ruin the roadmap of Ethereum by not listening enough to outsiders out of this call and by setting priorities based on development rather than based on the pressures on the Ethereum network.
Ansgar?
Right, I just wanted to say that I agree with Proto that it seems to me that kind of from a how important and urgent is this point of view, 4844 is the only urgent upgrade. Like withdrawals, we want to prioritize because we've been promising it for a long time. That makes sense, but it's not in itself urgent. EOF, again, we have been wanting to do EVM upgrades for a long time, and I think it's a very sensible upgrade, but in itself, it's not urgent. 4844 is urgent. So I don't think that necessarily in itself means we should not do a withdrawals only Shanghai fork, but I do think that would depend on how much we believe this would delay 4844. If basically we say having a separate fork means 4844 arrives 3 months later, then I would very strongly be in favor of having one combined bigger fork. If people are confident that just separating it out into 2 separate forks has no or minimal overhead, I'd be fine with separating it out. But again, it would be very strongly dependent on the impact on 4844, not just the readiness of the other EIPs.
Right. I think it's worth noting in the chat, there were a couple comments about withdrawals actually being like quite urgent and critical, and beyond getting people their stake back, there's a lot of concerns about centralization and people not being able to move their stake around, so giving people the opportunity to withdraw is not only about the like Ether liquidity, it's about like allowing people to then stake with providers, either stake themselves or stake with providers that they think are better, because there's been a lot of changes to the staking landscape since the Beacon chain went live. Jesse? Jesse, if you're talking, we can't hear you. Oh, still can't hear you.
Hello?
Oh, yes, now
Hello,
we
can you
can.
hear me?
Yes, now we
Sorry
can.
about that. Just chiming in with the Coinbase perspective, the first thing is that withdrawals are the P0 #1 priority for us. Just like other client teams here, it seems like everyone is aligned from my perspective that pushing for withdrawals to get out as safely and quickly as possible is the most important thing we can be doing. Second, I think from other CFI EIPs, 4844 is the highest priority for us. We, as I mentioned at DevCon, are actively working to bring our customers on chain. Currently, we can't bring them onto Ethereum L1 because it's too expensive. Currently, we can't even bring them onto Ethereum L2 because it's too expensive. And we see 4844 as a key unlock for actually enabling us to be able to bring our customers on chain and kind of continue investing in the Ethereum ecosystem. And so that's a really important priority for us. And then I guess the third thing that I would say, and this is not a priority input, but more just a process input, which is I feel like there are kind of two cogent paths that we can take at this point. One is we say like withdrawals are the most important thing, and we should do nothing that blocks that. And that means we're not going to take on additional scope, and we're going to just push as quickly as possible to get out withdrawals, and then ship everything else that we want to do in the next hard fork. I think the second cogent path is we say withdrawals are the most important thing, and we believe that we have capacity to do X number of other things, and then we have a priority conversation about what those X number of other things are. I think if we get into the situation where we say like a third path, which I think is being proposed, which is like withdrawals are the most important thing, and we think we can just slot something else in. And we need to decide based on like the people who are kind of driving which respective things, which of those is like the right thing from a size perspective to not impact withdrawals. It's going to just get subjective, messy, and I don't think lead to a good outcome, both from a process perspective and from a kind of timing perspective. And so I'd encourage us to try and like decide which of those two paths we're going to take first, and then have the downstream conversation, which feels like it will lead to the best outcome.
Liam and then Guillaume.
I fully agree with what Jesse just said. I just wanted to say something like
you're breaking up, Liam.
Clearly 48.
Oh,
here, let me check. Is it okay now?
A bit better. Yeah, try.
Okay, if it's breaking up, okay, I'll try really fast. From the optimism perspective, 4844 is like clearly our priority, because we see it as an unlock for basically Ethereum specifically being like establishing it as like the sole place you'd want to be going if you're going to be building any new sort of sovereign blockchain environment. We, from just purely having operating Optimism mainnet, constantly see projects that come to us saying they would be on Optimism or more generally an Ethereum rollup if it were the case that 4844 or more generally Ethereum was just affordable to them for their use case. And instead they don't, and they move to other ecosystems or other worlds that don't offer the Ethereum security or any of the Ethereum ecosystem benefits. So I'm saying the obvious here, but 4844 is not just like a win for rollups, it's a win for Ethereum, because all of these projects and these users that are going to other ecosystems will have no reason to, because Ethereum's ecosystem will offer the exact same price at the Ethereum security that we're already familiar with. And so, I'm saying the obvious, but I think it matters quite a lot.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Guillaume, you had your hand up?
Yep. So I was actually going to give some pushback on what Jesse has said. We have those projects. Different people are interested in everything and in different things, and they're pushing for their own for what they think is correct. I mean, we've been hearing different views. So some people believe withdrawals are more important. Some people believe 4844 is more important. I have to say both of them are important in my view. The question is, I don't get the impression that either of those efforts are ready, and I don't get like are ready to ship, and I also don't get the impression that there's a lot of conflicts between the two. So we could perfectly have two forks like very close to each other, like clearly not the same week, but 1 or 2 months apart. And I mean, I would say, sorry for the strong wording, but I don't care what the internal conversation at Coinbase is. They are free to allocate the resources how they see fit, but we're not going to. I mean, I don't think we should make a decision before we have any clarity on what projects are going to be delivered at what time. We just need to focus on delivering things. There's a lot of important things to be delivered in Ethereum. We need to work on that, and whenever it's ready, it will ship. I think that's the wisest approach.
Right. I think on that though, there is like there's like a path dependency thing here. So for example, if we say if we say that 4844 is the next thing we're going to ship, obviously client teams put more resources on it and it happens quicker. If we say EOF is the next thing we're going to ship, the same thing happens there. And there's not an infinite amount of resources in client teams. I think another thing, like just from the chat, there was a lot of conversations around, if we forked in March with like withdrawals and maybe, some minimal stuff, could we then have another fork with say 4844, like around May or June? And is that something that's like possible? So I don't know. I'd be curious to hear, like, just from the client teams, like, again, everyone seems agreed that like withdrawals is the main priority, and we want to ship this as soon as possible, which realistically is probably around March. If we go down that path, is it realistic to include 4844 in that timeline? And if not, what's like a realistic timeline for 4844 to ship? Is it like we could ship it a month after because the work's all happening in parallel anyway? Or is it, we're going to need 3 months or 6 months? Lucas, I see you have your hand up.
So I want to remind something that Peter Shilagi said, I think like 2 or 3 core devs in the past, that realistically we are not able to deliver hard forks very fast. So having a timeline of 1, 2, or even 3 months between hard forks is probably not realistic. And this is because just coordinating all the devnet upgrades, giving time for people to test, etc., is a huge effort. And if we treat 4844 as similar high priority as withdrawals, I would say just bundle them in one big fork. This might delay it by a month or something or 2, but it will be generally a lot faster to production than doing 2 forks. And Nevermind is able to do that in terms of capacity.
Nice. Any other teams have a perspective on that?
I feel like we showed after the Berlin hard fork with a very quick London hard fork that we are capable of shipping forks quickly if the need arises. It's not the most fun, but it's very possible. So I don't think that we should make the assumption that we can only do 1 fork.
Yeah. And yeah, Berlin and London, I'm looking now, were less than 4 months apart. So Berlin shipped April 15th and London shipped August 5th, which is like just under 4 months. Marius?
Yeah, and I think we've improved quite a bit since then, especially in the testing department. And so one thing that I want to point out is that between Berlin and London, we kind of had to create new features. if the code is ready by February, then shipping the new fork is just testing it, and well, and testing is done by February. Then it's just enabling it on the test nets and then publishing the final thing. And that's exactly 2 months. 1 month for going through the different test nets, and 1 month in anticipation of the final hard fork. So we can, if the code is ready, we can push it in 2 months. If the code is not ready, then there's no discussion, because then we will delay the withdrawals for 4844. So if you can reasonably promise me that 4844 is completely ready and tested in basically January, then I think we could schedule it with together with withdrawals, but I don't think anyone is willing to make that commitment, and so we would delay withdrawals over that. And it's at least for the guest team, it's a different story with EOF. We have EOF ready, and it will be ready and tested by January, and so it's kind of a different story for us. It might be different for other client teams, but that's for them to say.
Thanks. Ansgar, and then if any other client teams wants to share. I think it'd be good. A lot of people are like typing this in the chat. I think it would just be good if some other client teams after want to share their thoughts on the call, because most people will be listening and not reading the chat that's barely visible on the YouTube stream. But yeah, Ansgar?
Sure. I just wanted to say that I would at least say that if we go with a minimal Shanghai, then I think the feature set there should be just be withdrawals plus things we want to include, but that we should be very ready to say in a month or so if it becomes obvious that these features are not quite ready and they would start delaying the fork to kick them back out. I think basically like a withdrawals plus ideally this and this kind of fork makes sense, but if we make it like if we basically bundle them too strictly now and then we have to delay the entire fork for it, I think that would be a failure.
Thanks. Daniel, then Paul.
Oh, it's okay. So quick one from me. Instead of like having strong opinion on what should go first and how, I will just give you a short information how what is the status in, for example, in Nethermind. So we are working in parallel on 4844 and in Withdrawals, and so from my perspective, it seems that Withdrawals are, but I agree with Marius that we could, work. That would be the best approach, to work in parallel on both of them, ship depending on what is the status of both. But I understand that it could be a problem for incapacity in some of the teams. But maybe we could actually ask what is the status between the teams of these EIPs. We're just talking what should be shipped, but we don't actually understand what is.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Let's do Paul, Dano, and then we can end with just client team sharing what the status is, and also when they would need to make a call about coupling or not coupling in order to not delay withdrawals. So, okay, sorry, then Solius just came on, but like Paul, Dano, Solius, and then if we can just get, the teams to share the status after that. Paul, please.
Sure, I just had a similar sentiment to the previous speaker that we're working on withdrawals in 4844 in parallel. I think doing a rapid fire fork is something that we're definitely open to considering. Might even in some ways help us because it kind of unblocks the two teams from each other, because Withdrawals is clearly a few steps ahead of 4844.
Got it, thanks. Dano?
So as far as Withdrawals and EOF and 4844, the efforts for the engineers are fairly segregated between EOF and the other consensus layer impacting things. So from a basic perspective, where EOF lands is completely disconnected from the consensus layer work. As far as my understanding of CL priorities, Withdrawals are much further along than 4844 work, but I should let them speak to what they want to do for together or separate.
Thanks. Solius?
Yeah, so I was just thinking, like 4844 is clearly not ready at the moment, and why we can't just, delay this decision for a bit and see what is the progress in the coming weeks or month on this 4844, because there are already some teams, like 6 teams or so, working on that. And if in a few weeks it becomes clear that like most of all the problems are solved, then maybe it makes sense to strongly consider to include in the next hard fork, because at least from our experience, it's much easier to implement something that is already implemented by other teams and confirm it on the testnet, comparing to building the new feature which is not tested and completed. So I think at least from my point of view, it looks like the decision for 4844 probably needs to be delayed a bit until until there are much more clear what is the actual status, and just wait a bit until we have more results from the next testnets.
Yeah, I think that's probably like the best place to end, is just from the different client teams that are, if like within say like 1 minute, can share roughly where they're at with the different implementations, but also most importantly, like when do they need a decision about what gets coupled together, right? Like, because it seems like so far the discussion is kind of saying that these things are pretty modular, specifically 4844, EOF, and withdrawals. They can all kind of progress in parallel, but obviously at some point we're going to need to like bundle them together, assuming we didn't want to delay withdrawals and we wanted those to happen around March of next year, when the client teams need to know which path we're taking, right? Like and kind of commit to something rather than just pursue different things in parallel. Yeah, I don't know if any client teams want to share this.
Yeah, I think it will be good to resolve discussion as soon as possible about EOF versus EIP for 844, because if we really want to do something in March, besides withdrawals, we need to know it like right now. I mean, okay. Very, very soon, right?
Yeah, of course. Liam, and then if any other client teams want to jump on.
One thing I'll just really quickly shout out is there are regular 4844 developer calls. One is curious or would be willing to kind of join those calls. That's the right place to discuss the status of testing. These have been happening regularly for a while now, and we go pretty in depth. So if anyone is curious, they don't feel like there's a sufficient amount of information, whether their questions are being answered, like that's the place to discuss them. And there's like a regular cadence of these things. So I'd recommend anyone join.
Yeah, thanks. I posted the information on the chat there. I don't know if Mario is on to talk about testing, but if not, yeah, curious from other client teams if when a decision needs to be made about coupling, if we want to ship something around March. POTUS?
I can just report on Prism and what's the status on withdrawals. We are pretty much on schedule and we can have full testnets by January, and I'm pretty happy to fork withdrawals for Gurley. If a decision is made to include 4844, it doesn't matter when you tell us because it's clearly going to delay withdrawals anyways.
Got it. Any other team have perspective there?
Yeah, from Nimbus, similar as Prism.
Okay.
Yeah, totally the same. If we wanted to do a March upgrade, I think we'd need to know the contents nailed down by the next call in 2 weeks, I'd suggest.
Paul?
Yep, I agree with the previous speakers.
Okay. So there's kind of a trade-off there where earlier Marius was saying, like, you want to have the code already, and that minimizes the time to ship this thing once we decide to do it. Obviously, it's unrealistic to have all the client implementations for either EOF or 4844 done in the next 2 weeks. But is it more valuable to like make that decision sooner and kind of decide which path we're going on the next call, or is it more valuable, at least on the EL side, to wait a bit more and potentially to the first call of next year to make that call, because we see we sort of see more data about what these are. Okay, one chat comment about deciding sooner rather than later.
So I think for Geth, it doesn't matter too much because we have EOF mostly done. 4844 is also being worked on by Coinbase and Optimism. So Geth will probably be like the first one to have like the finished versions of everything. So I think it makes more sense for. So we don't really need to know prioritization because it's all almost done. I think it makes more sense for smaller client teams that have like resource constraints to speak up and say that like they need to prioritize, right? They need to prioritize one over the other. And I think it's important for them to say how much time they would need to like if we decide not to go with EOF and to go with 4844 only, then they need to like probably like shift priorities quite a bit. And so I think client teams and smaller client teams and testing should comment on when they need to have the decision.
Yeah, same with Prism. We will continue supporting 4844. We'll continue working on it, but it will just be a separate branch. So we will not be merging any 4844 stuff into our main develop branch unless it's confirmed. So for us, confirming like sooner or later, it doesn't really matter.
Got it. Thanks. I guess Liam and Potus have your hands up. We can wrap up with you guys because we're already at time. And so please, Liam. Oh, Liam.
No, that was a misclick. Sorry.
Okay, no worries.
I'm just quoting what I wrote in the chat. I think there's been consensus, and unless I'm mistaken, everyone here agreed that we do not want to delay withdrawals, and no one claimed that we can actually ship 4844 as early as we're thinking we can ship withdrawals. So I think on the CL side, every decision is already made. We are not shipping 4844 in February as we're thinking, February, March as we're thinking with withdrawals, and then the remaining EIPs do not affect us. So I think this is a no problem for CLs, and the decisions are already been made.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's like probably a good place to wrap up. Like I think then the question for the CL kind of moves to like how you can schedule and pace these forks. And obviously there's the CL call next week where that can be discussed. So I think it makes sense for CL teams to have that conversation there. I think what probably makes sense on the EL side in the next 2 weeks is to get like a strong view from client teams around like which EIPs, what, if we want to do a fast withdrawals, what's the best set of EIPs that works for them there. And I think, trying to narrow down that scope and finalize it on the next call would be really valuable, so that we kind of head off to the holidays and we know, we know what's being included alongside withdrawals. So yeah, let's continue the 4844 kind of scheduling and sequencing conversation on the CL call next week. And if EL teams want to look at the other EIPs that are being worked on and consider what could be included without delaying withdrawals, we can consider that on the next call. Anything else people want to share before we wrap up? And we didn't get to the engine API stuff. Apologies again. We discussed this a bit on the CL call last time, but Mikael, maybe is there a 1 minute thing that you want to bring up?
Can we? I would like to give a 30-second update on the withdrawal testnet.
Yes,
we started a devnet with Geth Nethermind, Prism, Lighthouse, Lodestar, and one more.
Teku.
Yeah, sorry, Teku, and all of the clients are still following the chain. I think maybe Lighthouse had some has some issues, but so we're on track, and it's going pretty well. So I'm very bullish on withdrawals.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, and I think next call, because we did get sort of sidetracked by basically everything else on this call. I think next call we should start with an update on where withdrawals are at. That'll help kind of ground everything, and then we can also quickly discuss this engine API issue so that we don't skip it for a third time. Yeah. Okay, Barnabas, and then we have to close because we're already over time.
Yeah, sure. I would like to just mention that within 2 weeks, then I would like to be able to test for every client's withdrawal. And for that, I would like the client teams to reach out to me, because I'm organizing now for the withdrawal testnet. And if you have any problems or any questions, just let me know. You can find me on Discord. Or Barnabas.
Cool. Thank you. Anything else? Okay, well, thanks everyone, and talk to you all next week on the CL call, and then Awkward Devs after that.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.